Thanks a lot. It's really great to be here. Thanks to the organizers. I'm a bit nervous giving the first talk because usually I sit here and then I think, what do these people know? What do I have to add, or what do I have to lead for my talk? So I am a bit nervous doing this, and I thought, what should I talk about? And I think this connection between evolutionary game theory and theoretical ecology is, to me, very interesting. It's very close to my heart. I worked on this with Corinna Tanisa during a sabbatical a few years ago, and but it's very basic. So I think everything here is known. And I think I'm old enough to speak about things that I think should be known. And I think I'm sometimes even old enough to just kind of repeat what I said earlier. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this workshop a lot. So this is for those who have looking at this picture. So those who have worked in Plön, and there are quite a few here. This is what we do every day, right? We just go swimming in the adjacent lake. So how did evolutionary game theory start? I mean, to me, it started with this paper by Maynard Smith and Price on the logic of animal conflict. And they actually wanted to describe fighting behavior in animals. And this is somehow kind of a point where kind of game theory became a natural part of biology. And the interesting thing to me is that in this paper, although it's about game theory, there's not so much evolution. And there's not evolutionary dynamics in our modern sense in it. Basically, they use a computer to calculate payoffs, but they don't use a computer to look at dynamics. So what is the game they consider? They look at the hawk-dove game, which is a game about kind of fighting about a resource. And there's a cost of fighting and a value of the resource. So you can be aggressive, you can be a hawk, and then you get the resource with, say, 50% probability if the other one is also aggressive, but you also pay a cost of fighting. Or you can be non-aggressive. That means kind of if the other person is aggressive, you just give up, you get kind of nothing. But if you find another person who's peaceful, you might share. And if you look at the famous replicator equation, which is basically kind of the change in the abundance of a strategy is proportional to the abundance times the difference between that strategy and the average fitness in the population, then you have this replicator equation. In this situation, you would find a situation where there's an intermediate level of aggressiveness that is in the end stable. And I will kind of mostly work with the replicator equation today. So what are the typical assumptions here? The typical assumptions are hawk and dove are just two behavioral traits in one species. Everything else is identical. So there's the identical life cycle, identical reproduction. Every biological feature of the system is the same for two of these strategies. So if you instead kind of think about ecology, in theoretical ecology, the most famous example are these kind of predator-prey dynamics, which is a special case of the more general Lotka-Volterra system. I wrote down kind of for two types the Lotka-Volterra equations on the top right. So there's this kind of interaction that's a two-species interaction, and that means life cycles, reproductions, everything is completely different. So in this case, kind of you look at the abundance of prey and predator, and you find these closed circles. But these are just kind of two species. In this case, they are furry animals, but that's all they have in common. So they are completely different. And still, you can map one system to the other. So this translation is actually translating between kind of the Lotka-Volterra equations and the replicator equation, or vice versa. That's straightforward. That's all included in the book of Hofbauer and Sigmund. It was actually the motivation to write this book. Nothing is new. This is how I do this in my lecture. I will go into this in a little bit more detail in a moment. But this is very well understood. But conceptually, I think it's a problem. Because, for example, there's a paper here by Jeff Gore who's looking at snowdrift game dynamics and cheating in yeast. And he has a system in yeast where he wants to kind of describe these interactions as a problem of cooperation. And if young Jeff Gore would say, I'm interested in cooperation between two different yeast strains, then Josef Hofbauer, and I got the only public picture I could find when I put together this talks, was this one. I think this is typical for Josef Hofbauer, if you know him. He would say to Jeff Gore, then you should look into 3x3 games. And I would be very puzzled by this. If I'm an experimentalist and say I want to look at the interaction between two things, then some mathematicians tell me, look at three things. That's strange, right? So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So these two type interactions in ecology, let's write down the Lotka-Volterra equation. So my dot is always the temporal derivative. So the change in strategy Y, or in abundance of species 1, is kind of Y1 times there's some growth rate plus some interaction matrix. And the interaction matrix includes kind of what is the fitness effect of the abundance of others who are my species on me, and what is the impact of the second species on me. And in this predator-prey model, you basically drop kind of two of these things. You drop the self-interaction, and then you have growth terms, predation, and a death term here. So the prey is just growing in the absence of the other type, and then it's suffering from predation. and the predator is dying if it's alone, but it's benefiting from predation. And that gives you these closed cycles. So if you want to turn this into game theory, I mean, the proof is a bit more complex, how you get to this, but it's not very complex, but you can write it down on one page. But I just want to say, what's the recipe? And the recipe here is you start with a predator-prey system. You write down this matrix first between prey and predator. I said self-interaction terms are 0, so the diagonal is 0. I have these two off-diagonal elements that are, in my example, alpha and beta. And then what I do is I extend this matrix by putting the growth rates to the end and putting a column, the column with the growth rates and a line with zeros. And that is now a game theoretical matrix that I'm free to play with. And I can just analyze this game. This is a 3x3 game. And I'm somehow tempted to say one is the predator, the other one is the prey, and the third is something. It's some additional type that I just need for, I would say, for mathematical convenience, but not so much for biological insight, because there's still only two types. But the game theory, of course, has to kind of, in a way, kind of intuitively, the predator-prey dynamics lives in this kind of positive half plane. So it is a two-dimensional dynamics. So if you have a game, you want to have a two-dimensional dynamics, you have to put it into the simplex and you need the third type. So, but conceptually, this translation is difficult. And one is, I think this equivalence, I have never seen it being used by empiricists. So it's somehow something that is there and we all appreciate it. And I have used it for many years in the sense of, oh, by the way, I'm doing game theory, but essentially it's the same as ecology. So I'm doing the same thing. I just use this language. And I just don't go to this other side. But I don't think it's used by empiricists. And instead, many of us, we mix the language of evolutionary game theory and ecology in a somewhat arbitrary way. For example, we say cooperation evolves, and then we look at growing populations. It can be okay, but we have to be a little bit careful. And the last thing is kind of this change in the number of types is almost always ignored. So I don't know people who would take this serious in empirical work and say, okay, let's add a third type. So, but there's hope. And the hope is kind of with this dimensionality change, this is not necessary if all growth rates are the same. And there's many insightful things. This is hidden as an exercise in the book of Hofbauer and Zygmunt. And that's exercise 752 in the 1998 edition, I think. And that's show if all the growth rates are equal in the n-dimensional Lotka-Volterra equation, then you can look at the replicator equation with exactly the same interaction matrix. So you don't have to extend it. You don't have to change it in any way. You just look at the exact same matrix if all growth rates are identical. Okay, and this is for me complicated because they have n-dimensional stuff and I can't think about this, so I just go to two-type interactions. So, and then let's kind of first take a step back and think, how do we actually classify these interactions? And I think this is complicated. So this is, for example, from a cliff in Schleswig-Holstein, actually, where kind of there are many bird species breeding, and I don't know what they're doing. I think it's very complicated to think what is one species doing to the other. But what is clear to me that there is space competition, because where there's one of these big birds, the little birds can't breed anymore. So somehow there's an interaction that is space competition, which means it's negative for both of them that the other one is around. And in a similar way, kind of ecologists have this classification in terms of kind of there's competition on the lower left. Then there's some sort of predator-prey dynamics where one type benefits and the other one suffers from this interaction. And there's mutualism where both benefit and this inverse predator-prey dynamic. So this is, for example, space competition. Then there's kind of one individual eating a species, an individual of the other species. This is somehow kind of mutualism where they kind of get rid of parasites and somebody can benefit from eating the parasites. And this is just the inverse interaction. And often kind of we just say kind of this is a plus-plus or a plus-minus interaction or whatever. And for me, it's interesting that it's enough to not look at the diagonal elements here. They just look at the off-diagonal elements, and then you can just plot this on this axis. A12 is now the effect that species 2 has on species 1, and A21 is the effect that species, or the opposite effect that 1 has on 2. So how do I look at the dynamics? I start with this, and then I write down my general Lotka-Volterra system. And then there's kind of one area on the upper right where things actually diverge. Let's not focus on this. Let's look at the rest of this here. And then in addition, we just now, for now, we assume identical growth rate as in exercise 752 of Hofbauer and Zygmunt. And in addition, we assume that these diagonal elements, they are negative. And that ensures that either species alone is not exploding. So it's kind of a carrying capacity-like system where if the other one is absent, it's actually logistic growth. And which one you make larger or smaller doesn't really matter. Otherwise, you just kind of change everything in one dimension. So what happens if you just kind of have this dynamics and you pick an A1 and an A2? So you pick some point in the space. Then you look at this kind of dynamics. For example, anywhere you start, you would, in this example, go to this filled circle here, which is a stable fixed point, and there are two unstable fixed points. You always end up in this one point. And then you could just kind of say, in this case, I just pick the parameters down here, and that's a case where type 2 dominates because you're going to a point where x1 is 0 in the end, or sorry, y1 is 0 and y2 is some positive number. If you do this in a similar way, you would find kind of regions where type 2 dominates, where type 1 dominates, where there's a bistability or where they coexist. So in this case, it was kind of type 2 dominating. Then you have some sort of interior fixed point. They both coexist at a finite size. Here there's bistability. So you either go to this point or to this point, depending on where you start. And here you always go to the lower right. Okay, so far so good. So this is just ecology. But when you think about this, you realize that this stability pattern here, so there's of course the axis that I had, this plus plus minus minus and so on. And there's these colored lines, and these are stability regimes. And these stability regimes and this evolutionary game theoretical classification that we all like, they're identical. So in this area here, there's always coexistence. And for an ecologist, it's normal that sometimes coexistence is driven by competition in this area, sometimes by mutualism, and sometimes by antagonistic interactions. So that means I could just kind of think about this as a game now. Think about the same payoff matrix. I write down my replicator equation. Then I say on the upper left, I would just go to the left. Here I would go to some point in the center. I would have a bistability, and I would just go to the right. So in this way, kind of the dynamics that I get from my ecological system is just what I would get as a classification in terms of game theory. But this classification of ecology is not really part of game theory, which is fine. But for example, if I look at this star, then you kind of start thinking of what is this star? What is this game? And so you can see kind of where are you in this coordinate system. So A12 is smaller than A22, and kind of A21 is larger than 0, but that doesn't really matter, but also larger than A11. In addition, we have this here. So what game is it? That the red star, yeah.
Oh, there.
Okay. Not everybody throws objects at me yet. So okay, you can kind of A22 is smaller than A11. So A22 in addition is larger than A12. So A12 would be here on the left-hand side. Then I have kind of A21 is larger than A11, so it goes to the right-hand side. So that would mean, what did I say?
A12, A22, A11.
And if you write this down as a game in terms of 1, 2, this would be kind of sorry. So that means you always go down because this A21 is larger than A11, A22 is larger than A12, but at the same time, this is smaller than this. So this is a presence dilemma, which is fine, and I will come to this in a moment. But when I talk to other people who are not doing game theory, there's kind of that they have different definitions of cooperation. So, for example, Wenying Xu from London, she would say, no, cooperation is when it's better to be together than to be alone, which, in my opinion, is a good definition, but it's more like a mutualism definition. These two numbers have to be positive. And my younger self would say cooperation is playing C in a presence dilemma. And to me, it's actually it took me like 10 years to realize that we're working in non-overlapping parts of the parameter space. And it's very difficult to communicate with people when you have just very different languages and you're living in these different areas. So again, kind of this stability and classification from evolutionary game theory coincide when the growth rates are identical. So what happens now if I have different positive growth rates? And what happens is that my purple line, sorry, this is purple, is that correct? Okay, so my purple lines here, move. So they kind of, this one moves a little bit up and becomes blue, and this moves a little bit left and kind of also becomes blue. And I just move them by this factor, R1 divided by R2 times A22. It's now the new line, and this is just R2 divided by R1. So I move these domains of stability. And in particular, I move this to the left of my Prison's dilemma here, which means now my Prison's dilemma is coexistent. So suddenly I can stabilize cooperation by doing this. So changing growth changes these domains of stability, but with changing growth rates, I somehow lose this game theoretical interpretation, because as someone who believes in this work of Hofbauer and Sigmund, I have to say, okay, now I have to do a thing. I have to kind of change the dimensionality. I have to introduce a 3x3 game to reflect the growth rates. Of course, nobody does this. So what we should do is we can say, okay, we should not really look at these plots anymore. So I think this is dangerous to look at them, because somehow we should look at a simplex, and we don't. But on the other hand, we can still do ecology. We can still look at these Lotka-Volterra plots. So why is this even interesting? I think it is interesting because there's a lot of discussion about this on how we use this in biology. And kind of one thing is kind of game theory in yeast. And this is a famous paper by my former colleague, Duncan Gregg, on the Prison's dilemma and polymorphism yeast genes. And they argue that there's some Prison's dilemma. And to me, that means they would have to show, maybe I go here. They would have to show that, fitness is an increasing function, and it's maximized when there's full cooperation, but still selection goes to defection. They didn't do it in this paper, but then Jeff Gore wrote a paper with a Snowdrift game. And if it's a Snowdrift game, and there I'm also kind of like a purist, I would kind of want to go to the definition that, for example, Christoph Howard gave one day, is still fitness is increasing in the abundance of cooperation, but there's a stable fixed point in the middle. So you select against maximal population fitness, and you would go to this point. That's also something they didn't really check. They did many other things in this paper, but they didn't really check that. But a couple of years later, this paper came out. A mixture of cheats and cooperators can enable maximal group benefit. So they measured fitness. They found that fitness is maximum in this point where there's actually stability, which is in a way really nice, but it's also not very interesting. Because this is not a social dilemma at all. If kind of evolution just leads to the point where population fitness is maximized, yeah, this is a good experimental system, but from the perspective of a social dilemma, it's not the most exciting case. And so what's going on here? So if you have this Prison's dilemma and you change a single growth rate, you can turn it into a coexistence game. So we start from some arbitrary numbers, and we have some Prison's dilemma, and you would always select for defection. And in my Lotka-Volterra plot, this would look like this. We just go to this point. And if, on the other hand, I have different growth rates, I should not plot this. I should just not plot this. I should plot a simplex instead. But I can, of course, still do the same thing down there. And then I find this coexistence point. And it's a bit, I think it's a bit of an unfair situation. It's like I make you play a Prison's dilemma, but if you cooperate, you get $5 extra. That's somehow a different game. And I could, of course, plot the simplex here, but people don't do that. So experimentally, kind of what they do in this paper, they also measure these growth rates. And there's a certain sugar that is abundant or not abundant, and kind of in the abstract, they say 99% of what is produced is just lost. And lost means it's just given to the neighboring cells. But losing 99% still means you keep 1%. If you assume for a moment that this 1% is just what they plot in the supplement of figure 10 here on this axis, you're here, and that means the mean growth rate is substantially larger than at 0. So you can actually argue that here cooperators get an extra benefit with this additional type. So let me come to the summary. So the replicator dynamics and the Lotka-Volterra equations are equivalent, but it's hardly ever used. When growth rates differ, and I think usually they will, then we should go to a high dimension if we want to take this equivalent serious. And not doing this is possible, but then we just have to use the language with a little bit more care than we sometimes do. Okay, I should thank the people I'm working with, not only Corinna and Chaitanya, who contributed parts of this, but also kind of my group. And we always put the old picture in the back, so everybody's still around. Okay, that's it.